The Korean Mafia boss hired a black waitress to be his decoy. He wanted a target to distract his enemies. He ended up hiring the woman who would dismantle his entire rival syndicate alone. They laughed when she walked into the inner sanctum of the Han family, a woman in a stained diner apron and a cheap bob standing before the most cold-blooded strategist in Seoul. One lieutenant sneered at her calloused hands. Another joked that Tae-young was finally senile enough to hire table service for a war zone. Imani Brooks heard every snicker. She understood the weight of every condescending look. She simply filed every exit, every weapon holster, and every arrogant face away for later. When Han Tae-young's advisor demanded to know why a waitress was worth $1 million contract, she didn't show them a CV. She didn't even speak. She reached into her pocket and placed a single scorched brass casing on the mahogany table, a custom caliber used only by deep cover cleaners in the Sahel. "I don't serve coffee," she said, her voice like grinding stones. "I serve the peace that follows a massacre. You aren't hiring a girlfriend, you're hiring the wall between you and the grave." The office on the 50th floor of the JH Tower smelled of expensive cedar and the metallic tang of a storm rolling in over Seoul. Han Tae-young did not sit behind his desk. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his reflection a silhouette of sharp lines against the city lights. Behind him, Imani Brooks sat perfectly still in a chair that cost more than her diner's entire inventory. She had traded her stained apron for the tailored gray blazer, but the stillness in her eyes remained, a predatory, watchful calm. $25 million, Tae-young began, his voice a low melodic rasp. "That is the current price for my heart. In the underworld, a bounty that high isn't just a contract, it's a religious calling. It has drawn every bottom feeder and high-tier predator from Vladivostok to Singapore." He turned, his obsidian eyes scanning Imani's face for a flicker of fear. He found none. On her cheek, the faint scar caught the light, a jagged reminder of a world he suspected she knew better than she let on. "My inner circle is compromised," Tae-young continued, pacing the room with the measured gait of a man who knew he was being hunted. "My soldiers and suits are predictable. My rivals, the Beck family, have already mapped their faces, their shift rotations, and their loyalties. If I walk into the gala this weekend with 20 bodyguards, I'm a clear target. But if I walk in with a beautiful, unassuming woman on my arm, I'm the bait," Imani said, her voice cutting through his explanation with clinical precision. Tae-young inclined his head. "You are the distraction. They expect me to be guarded by soldiers. They don't expect me to be distracted by romance. While they focus on the waitress I've plucked from obscurity, my real security will be hunting the shooters in the rafters. You just have to stand there, look out of place, and let them think I've grown soft." Imani stood up, the movements fluid and devoid of wasted energy. She walked toward the window, looking out at the sprawling metropolis. She knew what he didn't, that she wasn't just a wall, she was a landslide. "You're playing a dangerous game, Han Tae-young," she whispered, her reflection meeting his in the glass. "You think you're hiring a shield, but you're opening the door for a ghost. If I do this, when the smoke clears, I want the ledger on the Seoul operation, and I want my life back." Tae-young felt a cold shiver of intuition. He had hired her to be a pawn, a flashy piece of jewelry to misdirect a sniper scope. But as she stood there, silhouetted against the lightning-split sky, he realized he might have just invited the storm inside. The transition from the high-rise office to the memory was seamless, triggered by the weight of the handgun Tae-young's advisor had placed on the desk. To Tae-young, Imani was a curious anomaly he had discovered by chance. To his advisor, Kim, she was a miracle found in the neon-lit rain of a Tuesday night. It had happened 3 days prior, at a 24-hour convenience store 3 blocks from the diner. Kim had been inside, buying a pack of cigarettes, when the bell above the door chimed, not for a customer, but for 3 men in leather jackets carrying sawed-off shotguns. They were erratic, fueled by adrenaline and cheap synthetics, screaming for the clerk to open the safe. Imani had been at the back of the store, reaching into a cooler for a bottle of water. She didn't duck. She didn't scream. She simply checked the convex security mirror in the corner, her eyes mapping the room with the cold geometry of a computer processor. The first gunman turned toward her, the barrel of his weapon beginning to rise. Imani moved before he could register the color of her eyes. It was a blur of gray fabric and calculated momentum. She closed the 6-foot gap in 2 strides, her palm striking the underside of the shotgun's barrel, redirecting the blast into the ceiling tiles. Before the roar of the discharge had even faded, her elbow found the hinge of his jaw. 1 down. Time elapsed, 4 seconds. The second man pivoted, but Imani was already using the first man's fallen body as a shield. She stepped into his personal space, her hand snapping out to seize his wrist. A sickening pop echoed through the narrow aisle as she used his own momentum to snap the joint. She caught his falling weapon mid-air, not to shoot, but to use the heavy stock as a bludgeon against the third man's temple. The third gunman didn't even have time to pull his trigger. He collapsed into a display of glass-bottled sodas, the sound of breaking glass punctuating the sudden silence of the store. Kim had watched from the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs, as Imani calmly set the captured shotgun on the counter. She didn't check the bodies. She knew exactly how much damage she had dealt. She picked up her bottle of water, walked to the register, and placed a $5 bill next to the trembling clerk's hand. "Keep the change for the tiles," she had said, her voice as flat as a dial tone. She had walked out into the rain, leaving 3 men incapacitated and a veteran Mafia advisor questioning everything he knew about civilian waitresses. 22 seconds had passed from the moment the first gun was pulled to the moment she cleared the door. It wasn't just a fight, it was an audit of human fragility. The Han family estate was a masterclass in architectural arrogance, a sprawl of glass, black granite, and hidden steel nestled in the hills overlooking Seoul. As the armored sedan glided through the heavy perimeter gates, Imani felt the shift in atmosphere. This wasn't a home, it was a bunker dressed in silk. When she stepped out of the car, the air was thick with the scent of rain and mountain pine, but it was quickly soured by the visible disdain of the security detail. 10 men stood in the courtyard, their posture rigid, their hands hovering near the lapels of their suits. To them, Imani was a liability in a blazer, a PR stunt by a boss who had finally lost his edge. "This is the shield?" one guard muttered in Korean, his eyes raking over her with a smirk. "I've seen more threats from house cats." Imani didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her mind was already operating on a different frequency, stripping the estate down to its skeletal frame. As Tae-young led her through the grand foyer, she wasn't admiring the Ming vases or the abstract art. She was counting the seconds between the sweep of the overhead security cameras. She noted the weight of the reinforced doors and the slight hum of the biometric scanners. Every corridor was a kill zone. Every floor-to-ceiling window was a potential entry point for a high-velocity round. She memorized the thickness of the drywall, calculating which walls would provide cover and which would turn into shrapnel under fire. "Your room is in the east wing," Tae-young said, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of the hallway. "Adjacent to mine. My men will be stationed at every exit." "Your men are looking for a war they can see," Imani replied softly, her eyes tracking a blind spot behind a decorative marble pillar. "They're watching the gates. They should be watching the ventilation shafts and the service tunnels." She stopped at a junction, her gaze lingering on a small, unobtrusive keypad. She knew the model. It was a legacy system with a 5-second bypass window. The head of security, a man named Daesham, with a jagged scar across his brow, stepped into her path. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame. "We have handled the boss's safety for a decade, girl. We don't need advice from a waitress who got lucky in a bodega." Imani looked up at him, her expression so vacant it was terrifying. She wasn't seeing a man. She was seeing a series of pressure points and structural weaknesses. She had already decided how she would neutralize him if he turned out to be the mole. 3 seconds, a collapsed trachea, and a silent drag into the shadows. "I hope you're as good as your ego, Daishem," she said, stepping around him without breaking her stride. "Because when the full moon rises, luck won't be on the menu." The gala was a sea of shimmering silk and calculated smiles, held in a private dining room where the walls were lined with ancient porcelain and the air was thick with the scent of roasted duck and treachery. Taeyong sat at the head of the table, his presence a gravitational force, while Imani occupied the seat beside him. She wore a backless black gown that hid the scars on her shoulder blades, but left her arms free for the physics of violence. To the rival investors across the table, she was merely an exotic trophy, a silent ornament in Taeyong's sudden, inexplicable lapse in judgment. Imani, however, was not listening to the talk of shipping logistics or market shares. She was listening to the rhythm of the room. She felt the slight vibration of the floorboards as a waiter approached from the left, too heavy on his heels for a professional server. She noted the way the man's eyes didn't settle on the wine glasses, but on the pulse points of Taeyong's throat. The air shifted. The waiter reached for a carafe, but his hand drifted toward the underside of the serving tray, where a ceramic blade was taped. Taeyong's hand moved toward the holster beneath his jacket, but he was a second too slow. The trajectory of the assassin's strike was already set. Imani didn't stand. She didn't even drop her cloth napkin. With a flick of her wrist that seemed almost casual, she snatched a heavy, faceted crystal paperweight from the mahogany sideboard behind her. In one continuous motion, she launched it. The crystal didn't just hit the man, it intercepted him. It caught the assassin squarely in the temple with a dull, wet thud of stone hitting bone. The tray clattered to the floor, the ceramic blade spinning uselessly away as the man crumpled like a puppet with severed strings. Silence fell over the room, cold and absolute. Taeyong's hand was still frozen halfway to his weapon, his eyes wide as he looked from the unconscious body to Imani. She was already reaching for her wine glass, her expression as unbothered as if she had just swatted a fly. "His gait was uneven," Imani said quietly, her voice the only sound in the vacuum of the room. "He was carrying 4 pounds of extra weights in his right sleeve. You should really vet your catering staff better, Han Taeyong." Across the table, the investors were pale, their masks of civility shattered. Daesham and the other guards rushed in, guns drawn and faces flushed with the shame of being outpaced by a woman they had spent the afternoon mocking. Imani just looked at the crystal paperweight resting on the rug, then back to the menu. The message was clear. The decoy was no longer playing a part. She was the only reason the boss was still breathing. The adrenaline from the dinner ambush had settled into a heavy electric silence by the time they reached the private balcony of the estate. The city of Seoul sprawled below them like a circuit board of neon blue and gold, indifferent to the blood that had almost stained the mahogany hours before. Taeyong poured 2 glasses of premium rice wine, the liquid clear and viscous as moonlight. He didn't offer a toast. He simply handed a glass to Imani and leaned against the railing, his tailored suit jacket finally discarded. "You move like someone who has died before," Taeyong said, his voice stripped of its usual command. He wasn't looking at her, but at his own hands, which were finally beginning to steady. That wasn't reflex. It was a premonition. Imani took a slow sip, the warmth of the wine blooming in her chest. She looked at the faint reflection of her own scar in the glass door. When you spend enough time in the dark, you stop looking for shapes and start feeling the displacement of air. The man tonight, he was a shadow that didn't fit. She turned to face him, the distance between them narrowing in the dim light. For the first time, the boss and the waitress were gone. There were only 2 people who had survived things they were never meant to witness. "I grew up in a place where the sun felt like a spotlight for snipers," Imani whispered. "I joined the service because I thought it would give my violence a purpose. Instead, It just made me a ghost with a government ID. I came to Seoul for stop being a weapon, Taeyong. But the world keeps reaching for the trigger. Taeyong turned his head, his dark eyes searching hers. I was born into the Dragon Syndicate. My father told me that mercy was a luxury for those who didn't want to lead. I spent 40 years building a throne out of bones, only to realize I'm just a high-value target sitting in a glass box. He reached out, his thumb grazing the scar on her cheek. It was a touch of recognition, not romance. We are both broken in exactly the right places, Imani. You were discarded by your country, and I am being hunted by my own people. We're not people to them. We're just assets to be liquidated. Imani didn't pull away. The looseness of the alcohol and the shared proximity to death had peeled back their layers. In the quiet of the balcony, she realized that they were the only two people in the world who understood the true cost of the peace they were currently enjoying. "The full moon is tomorrow," she said, her voice regaining its edge. "They'll come with everything, not just assassins, but the ghosts you've tried to bury." Taeyeon finished his drink, his expression hardening back into the granite mask of the Mafia boss, yet his eyes remained fixed on hers. "Then let them come. They think they're hunting a man and his decoy. They have no idea they're walking into the path of two people who have nothing left to lose." The moon hung low and swollen over the estate, casting a silver pallor that made the shadows in the garden look like ink. Inside the command center, the air was brittle. The monitors suddenly flickered, washed out by a wave of electromagnetic interference. Then, the first perimeter alarm wailed, a short, jagged sound that was instantly cut off as the exterior sensors were neutralized. The breach was surgical. From the darkness beyond the tree line, dozens of thermal signatures began to bloom on the remaining screens. The rival syndicate hadn't sent street soldiers, they had sent specialists. Black-clad figures scaled the perimeter walls with motorized ascenders, while a heavy transport truck rammed through the primary gate, breaching the courtyard in a spray of gravel and twisted steel. Taeyong stood, his hand already reaching for the suppressed submachine gun hidden beneath the mahogany desk. His jaw was set, the instinct of a warlord taking hold. Beside him, Daeshim and the remnants of the Iron Dragon security detail were shouting into their radios, their voices rising in a panicked crescendo as the feed showed the North Wing's glass ceiling shattering under a volley of flashbangs. "Get the men to the stairwell," Taeyong commanded, his eyes fixed on the encroaching tide. "We hold the inner sanctum." Imani moved then, her hand resting firmly on Taeyong's shoulder. The touch was heavy, grounded, and utterly immovable. She wasn't wearing a gown anymore. She was back in the charcoal blazer, her bob sleek, her expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. "No," she said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to silence the chaos in the room. "You stay in the office, lock the biometric deadbolt, and don't open it until you hear my voice. If you go out there, you're just a target. Down here, you're the prize. I need you behind the steel." Taeyong hesitated, his pride warring with the cold logic in her eyes. "Imani, there are dozens of them. This is a coordinated strike. Your men are trained to protect a boss. I was trained to erase an army. The difference is about to become very clear." She turned to Daeshim, who was staring at her in stunned silence. "If any of your men get in my way, I will treat them as hostiles. Stay behind me or stay out of the halls." She stepped toward the door, her silhouette framed by the emergency lights of the hallway. The first wave of intruders had already entered the foyer, the sound of rhythmic, suppressed gunfire echoing through the vents. "I'm going to work now," she said softly. She slipped into the corridor, and the door hissed shut behind her. As the lock engaged, Taeyong watched the monitor. He saw Imani merge into the shadows of the East Wing, disappearing so completely that the motion-activated lights didn't even flicker. The hunters were inside the house, but they had no idea that the most dangerous thing in the building had just been let off its leash. The first squad of the rival syndicate entered the grand gallery with tactical precision, their rifle lights cutting through the artificial fog of the triggered fire suppressors. They moved in a diamond formation, confident that their thermal optics would highlight any target. They didn't realize that Imani had already disabled the climate control, flooding the floor with liquid nitrogen from the kitchen stores, masking her heat signature in a roiling cloud of white vapor. She didn't use a gun. The sound of a shot was a beacon, and Imani Brooks was a ghost. Instead, she moved with a rhythmic, terrifying fluidity. She appeared behind the rear guard like a glitch in the security feed. A single palm strike to the base of the skull silenced him before he could key his radio. She caught his falling body, using his weight to pivot into the center of the formation. In the strobe-like flicker of the emergency lights, she was a blur of charcoal gray. She used a high-tensile garrote to sweep the legs of the lead scout, then utilized a tactical baton to deliver short, sparking bursts to the nerve clusters of the remaining two. They fell in a heap of tangled limbs and useless hardware. 12 minutes later, the secondary wave reached the atrium. These were the Yakuza cleaners, men who specialized in close-quarters blade work. They found their predecessors neatly stacked in the shadows, stripped of their communications gear. As they fanned out, Imani dropped from the decorative ceiling rafters. She didn't land, she fell like a hammer. She used the environment as her primary weapon. She shattered a heavy crystal vase, using the shards with the precision of a surgeon to sever the tendons of the closest attackers. When a swordsman lunged, she didn't retreat. She stepped into the arc of the blade, parrying with the reinforced forearm of her blazer and countering with the strike that collapsed his diaphragm. By the time the third wave reached the midpoint of the east wing, the psychological toll was visible. These were men who had survived wars, yet they were flinching at the sound of a falling shell casing or the creak of a floorboard. Imani was no longer just a bodyguard. She was an inevitability. She moved through the corridors not as a woman, but as a systematic error in their plan. 53 men had entered the house. As Imani reached the final corridor leading back to the office, the count was down to 3. Her breathing was steady, her bob still perfectly in place, though a spray of crimson decorated the cuff of her gray sleeve. She hadn't fired a single bullet, yet she had turned the most expensive hit in Asian history into a quiet, efficient massacre. The syndicate hadn't just been repelled, it had been dismantled, bone by bone, in the dark. The silence following the massacre was more oppressive than the gunfire. Imani stood at the end of the final corridor, the air smelling of ozone and copper. She didn't reload. She didn't have to. But then, a sound vibrated through the floorboards that made her blood turn to ice, the rhythmic, synchronized thrum of a high-altitude halo insertion. The glass ceiling of the central rotunda didn't shatter. It dissolved under precision-timed breaching charges. 4 figures descended on matte black fast ropes, moving with the lethality that made the previous syndicate assassins look like amateurs. These men didn't wear leather or silk. They wore dragon skin armor and quad-eye night vision optics. Imani stepped into the center of the rotunda, her hands empty but her stance low. The 4 operatives fanned out, their suppressed rifles leveled at her center mass. They didn't fire. They waited for the 5th figure to descend. Commander Elias Thorne touched the ground with the grace of a predatory bird. He unclipped his harness, his face revealed in the flickering emergency light, a landscape of burn scars and cold, bureaucratic cruelty. He was the man who had signed the order for her dishonorable discharge, the man who had tried to bury her in the sands of the Sahel. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Imani," Thorne said, his voice a polished rasp. "We tracked the bounty on Taeyong, but we didn't expect to find our most expensive asset playing house with a gangster. Spectre wants its property back." "I died in Libya, Elias," Imani replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming in her veins. "You're talking to a ghost, and ghosts don't have owners." Thorne smiled, a jagged movement of skin. "Ghosts don't bleed, but you will. The ledger you took, the names of the senators, the bank codes, it's the only reason you're still breathing. Give it to me, and I'll make your death quick. Otherwise, we'll take the boss, and we'll take him apart while you watch." The 4 operatives shifted, their fingers tightening on their triggers. Imani's mind raced through the tactical geometry of the room. She was outgunned, outnumbered, and facing the man who taught her everything she knew about survival. "You taught me one thing above all else, Commander," Imani whispered, her eyes locking onto him. "Never leave a witness." In one explosive motion, she kicked a dropped flash grenade toward the squad. As the world turned into a blinding white vacuum, the decoy vanished into the rafters. The final war wasn't about the Mafia anymore. It was about the ghosts of the state finally coming home to roost. The smoke had barely cleared from the rotunda when the transformation began. In the aftermath of the full moon siege, the Iron Dragon Syndicate didn't just survive, it evolved. The bodies of the Spectre operatives were never found by the local police. They simply ceased to exist, much like the classified files Imani had finally decrypted. Within 6 months, the blood-stained ledgers of the Han family were systematically liquidated, replaced by the transparent balance sheets of JH Global Industries. Shipping routes once used for contraband were converted into high-speed logistics networks. The shadowy cryptocurrency exchanges that laundered ransom money became the backbone of a legitimate fintech empire. Han Taeyong no longer sat in a dimly lit office with a gun beneath his desk. He sat in a glass-walled boardroom in Uido, wearing a suit that cost a teacher's yearly salary, making moves that shifted global markets instead of street territories. But the corporate polish was merely sophisticated camouflage. Deep beneath the headquarters of JH Global, in a secure level that didn't appear on any architectural blueprint, the air was cool and smelled of gun oil and server cooling fans. Imani Brooks stood before a digital map of the world, her sleek bob reflecting in the glow of 14 pulsing red icons. Each icon represented a specter cell, a shadow handler, or a black site that the world chose to ignore. Taeyong stepped into the room, 2 glasses of rice wine in hand. He no longer looked at her as a decoy or even a bodyguard. They were stakeholders in a new kind of venture, one dedicated to hunting the hunters. "The logistics for Paris are ready," Taeyong said, handing her a glass. "The French cell is being funded through a shell company in Luxembourg. We've already frozen their assets. They'll be desperate. They'll be loud." Imani took the wine, her eyes never leaving the map. The scar on her cheek was a silver thread in the low light. Desperate is good. It makes them sloppy, and Spectre can't afford to be sloppy when I'm the one coming for them. She drained the glass, the warmth a sharp contrast to the cold mission ahead. The Waitress was gone, and the Mafia boss had become something far more formidable, a legitimate titan with the resources to fund a private war. Together, they had realized that the only way to truly escape the shadows was to become the light that burned them out. "They thought we were prey," Taeyong whispered, standing beside her as the screen zoomed in on a facility in the Swiss Alps. Imani checked the weight of a specialized sidearm now holstered at her hip, a gift from the man who had once tried to use her as bait. They made the mistake of thinking the story ended at the estate. We're just getting to the part where they pay. The war against the shadows had begun, and this time the shadows were the ones who should be afraid. If you believe that true power is found in the people the world chooses to overlook, hit subscribe right now and tell us which chapter was your favorite. Only those who judge by the surface will miss the next mission. Make sure that notification bell is on, because Imani and Taeyong are just getting started.